Um, well, I'd like to thank the CNPA for working with me to put this together and to put something together that really represents not necessarily a presentation as much as it represents a report. And that report being on a condition I experienced personally, which was receiving a diagnosis of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and then starting to realize that whereas I knew what fibrosis was, I knew what it constituted as a repair mechanism. I had no real understanding of what fibrosis represented as a concomitant of the pathological process. And in an industry, in a world that's increasingly functioning with an emphasis on longevity and the maintenance of health, the fibrotic influence on how that can be brought to a halt or shortened is really one of the more unrecognized elements. It's quite apparent to me that we need to have a serious conversation as a profession, but also too in terms of the medical process itself with the fundamental significance of fibrosis. One fact that I was able to dig up was that about 45% of all the fatalities in the industrialized world will result from a fibrotic process. And by the way, at the end of this presentation, you'll get a link that will take you to a place where you can download the PDF. So sit back and leave the driving to us, as they used to say in the old airline ads, because ultimately, this is really not designed to be a slide deck in a presentation sense. As I said before, it's more of a report, and the deck itself really constitutes, I think, a reference source that hopefully will guide our future investigations and interests into this field, personally and professionally, but also too as people who function in the realm of chronic disease, perhaps maybe more than most other medical specialists. So again, this quote was quite a significant. Senescence and fibrosis cascade in layers. Excessive accumulation of senescent cells promotes the process of fibrosis, while fibrosis of organs and tissues accelerates the normal aging of cells. So if we talk about fibrosis in a sense of the uh, bigger significance of it, we have to talk about the fibrosis in a world of organs, because organs all fibrose. They share many elements of fibrosis, but they have other elements of the fibrotic process that are unique to the architecture of that specific organ. And we'll have to go through that, not necessarily to the depth that it would be as if, for instance, we were talking about nothing but renal fibrosis tonight or nothing but cardiac fibrosis, but we will touch on the relative differences geographically of fibrosis in some of the major organ systems. And I'm certainly not a cardiologist, I'm not a nephrologist. I only will talk about the role of fibrosis in those organs. But obviously they play a role in almost anything that factors into the degenerative process. The agenda is pretty simple. We're going to look at the face of chronic disease, which means we are going to understand from a molecular standpoint, really what's the basis of fibrosis, what it constitutes when done well as part of the healing process, what are the elements that start to cycle out of control that characterize the fibrotic process as a disease entity. And where does that differ? And where are the points where that difference is perhaps maybe controllable or even reversible? There'll be a lot of discussion of where natural products might have a role in terms of being able to sit in this environment and act perhaps maybe in early fibrosis. There's two or three elements in this presentation that I think are first-class clinical pearls that I think are going to be somewhat mind-boggling when we get to them. So not that I want to sell anything out to you beforehand. But other things we'll look at: fibrotic landscape, locations, interventions, factors, and if we have time, the end game, dealing with transplant and pre-transplant patients, because very often the end stage in fibrosis is complete end stage loss of organ failure, or organ failure to an end stage. And often right now, the only technology that is curative is, as I experienced myself firsthand, an organ transplant. And you will come in contact with more and more of this. My goal with this lecture was these particular two thematic elements. One, that quantity has a quality all of its own, and the sheer amount of information is not a reflective of a need for great complexity, but rather an indication of the size, scope, and depth of the fibrosis process. And it is a very, very complex, wide-ranging phenomenon, as you'll see. And much of this is going to be, to somebody who's not familiar necessarily with the core molecular biology, it might seem a little on the overwhelming standpoint, but given some time and understanding and familiarity, and that's why I think the handout is so important, you can become able to understand this from both a molecular standpoint and from a organ presentation standpoint. So again, the idea is to put as much in as possible, knowing that we'll not necessarily even touch on the whole picture. For instance, there was a article that came out today on fibrosis in skeletal muscle as a concomitant of sarcoidosis, and ultimately as sarcopenia, which of course we'll all deal with as we get older. And you know, the infiltration of that is obviously part of the aging process. So again, I just want to just give you some simple breakdowns here give you a sort of a opening salvo. Normal, and I hate people who read slides to people. Ultimately, I'm not going to necessarily read the slide to you. What I'd love to do would let you read the slide, and I just kind of riff on top of it, because ultimately I think that's just so much more of a user experience, you know. I will allude to things in the slide for sure. You know, strangely enough, in order to initiate fibrosis, you have to bleed a little. The process of bleeding, injury, represents the release of cellular components that have to do with platelet activation and the formation of the clotting and buttons that are part of wound healing. And again, going back to school, we know that this actually involves the conversion of fibrinogen into fibrin, which creates a meshwork, and then growth factors recruit the white blood cells, and these interact with T cells, and that stimulates a certain type of cell called a fibroblast. And fibroblasts then basically synthesize collagen 1 and collagen 2 and build the extracellular matrix up around the injury. And then the part of the cytokines that are involved, which are typically the result of handling the inflammatory changes that take place at the site. Interestingly, some of the cytokines that are involved in excessive amounts of fibrosis, interleukin-4 and interleukin-13, are known to be induced by dietary lectins. And in a conversation that I had with a fellow named Sheik, who's had a pulmonary transplant at Brigham Women's Hospital, he managed to bring up as almost an aside that they had been observing a case of fibrosis that hadn't gone on to transplantation, where the person had simply put themselves into a type of remission by going gluten-free. And that might be something, again, that ties in with the IL-13 and IL-4. Again, I don't know. I know one person who had fibrosis and adopted a gluten-free diet, and it didn't really help them that much. So to give you an idea of the complexity of what we're looking at a lot of dimensions here, folks. So you have myofibroblasts and ECM deposition. We'll go into that in detail. You have repetitive injury. So in situations where you have a lot of environmental insults that are done repeatedly, asbestosis, silicosis, cigarette smoke, industrial types of things. This actually starts to produce a large production of ROS, and that ROS basically starts to ramp up all the cell factors that are involved in wound healing, but starts to inhibit a lot of the control factors so that these other pro-fibrotic changes act essentially in a kind of uncontrolled manner. One of the most interesting things about fibrosis, and we'll go into this a little bit later, is it's got a long and strong link to aging in general. And one of the strongest links is what's known as telomere shortening. There's a situation in most of the common clinical fibrosis syndromes, but most particularly idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, where the person usually has a concomitant syndrome called short telomere syndrome. And the basis of that is typically a certain series of mutations that are part of the telomerase regeneration machinery. And so these people have below the 10th percentile in terms of telomere length. Other things to keep in mind, obviously, mitochondrial dysfunction, cell senescence, the general nature, and it's interesting because there's a direct connection between what we now call inflammaging and the production of out of control or pathological fibrosis. I'm trying to figure out how I can make you all smaller here. Well, may not happen. Okay, this is a map I drew that's really going to encapsulate our conversation. And I'm going to try. Why is it that, oh, can I make you smaller? I don't know. Okay, please go away. For some reason, my mouse is behaving as bad as my browser. Let me go back here. I just went too far ahead. How do I go backwards in this thing? Anybody know? Is it shift?
Left arrow.
Got it. So we're here.
Oh, your screen share went away.
Is it back?
It's not.
Yeah, it doesn't even give me the option to share it now. Was I made not the ringleader of this thing?
No, so I actually you're able to share right now. I made it so that you and I can both be the sharer.
Is that okay? There we go. And back we are. Okay, we should be back together.
You're back in action.
Play. All right. So again, we will continue to share. We will go through this in detail, but the bottom line here, and I wish I could get the mouse to go over this, but it seems to want to. Let's see. Nope. Anyway, we're going to do the best we can, folks. If you look up here, you're going to see a hexagon called TGFB1, Transforming Growth Factor 1. This is the big guy, okay? This is the one that tends to initiate fibrosis as an event. And it can be activated by inflammation. It can be activated by macrophages rather, the production of chemokines, as we said before, interleukins. This interacts with the transforming growth factor receptor, and really odd that I can't move my mouse over this darn thing. You know, I'm not normally this spaz, but what can I tell you? The situation is such we'll do the best we can with it. All of this we're going to go into some detail with, but the bottom line is if you just follow the flow, You see there in purple the TGF receptor. That's a tyrosine kinase receptor, like you see with epidermal growth factor. So it's a tripwire type effector. Once that thing is triggered, away you go. And that what happens is it activates, as you see on the left side of the screen, a series of molecules called SMADs, which then tend to migrate into the nucleus and actually send the make more collagen message. So this is really what's driving the fibroblast activity. And if you see directly right under the receptor that you have a chemical, their molecule called TNIC, and TNIC actually acts to boost that symbol, makes it more and more active. It just kind of keeps looping it. To the left of the diagram, we can see here mitochondria and hypoxia induction factor, which actually is another trigger that tends to set off the transforming growth factor cascade. So hypoxia, a mitochondrial stress, and the other pathway you see at the right side of the screen stems off of inflammation, which is an interesting thing because it doesn't directly play into the genesis of fibrosis, but inflammation plays a role in ramping up the machinery of fibrosis so that the active inflammation stimulates the macrophage to produce the interleukins that activates STAT3. STAT3 basically goes into the cell and actually ramps up the SMAD conglomeration to keep going. And the end result is that you wind up with a cascade where you wind up with fibroblasts become extremely active and deposited in the extracellular membrane, thickens and hardens, and largely because they convert into a form of superhero fibroblast called a myofibroblast, which is a much more powerful fibroblast in terms of being able to keep putting down extracellular membrane. Let's see here. Okay. I am not able to do this. Now this doesn't change. It's not recognizing my mouse. My.
Will the left and right arrows work for you?
My mouse doesn't seem to work on this, but let's just, okay, maybe.
Claudia is suggesting, can you close out of Keynote, close out of the Keynote share and then reshare again?
You know, thank you, Claudia. The mouse isn't working. So
I think you might be in the like drawing mode because there's this line now.
right.
So I
But how do
think
you get out of there?
uh is there like a little pencil mark in the bottom left corner that says like annotate?
There's a menu on the side, but I can't get the mouse over it. Hmm. I mean, I can't turn the pen off, unfortunately.
Even if you hover over the green like annotate button in the bottom left of
Oh,
Zoom.
Claudia, I think you're a genius.
Huh.
But now I'm stuck with all this stuff here.
Martha's asking, can Kathleen share and run the Keynote for you? I can do that if you'd like.
I'm gonna, thank you. Okay, so we back? Yes. Okay. Sorry, folks. Here's your extracellular matrix. Now, the way I understand this is like a bunch of schmutz that holds everything together. It's mostly, of course, the backbone of all the organ structure and function. And it's largely produced, as I said before, by fibroblasts or in an aberrant state by myofibroblasts. And it's largely, of course, this characteristic of all fibrotic diseases are going to have a huge overproduction of the ECM. And so basically, this is really the runaway part of the fibrotic process that we really don't really have a good handle on. Generally, when things get to that point, we really don't have anything that is essentially able to change the extracellular matrix. But as I said before, it's a type of glue, and it's disorganized, very messy, and it tends to disrupt organ function. So one of the things that has been studied in terms of being able to improve extracellular matrix function in fibrotic states is increasing autophagy. And again, autophagy is a sort of a cell eating process, generally involved through mTOR and the mechanisms involved in um, cell regulation with regard to controlling excess production materials and things. So generally, autophagy is why we sleep and wake up refreshed. The nature of autophagy in terms of how it works with the ECM is that it controls what are called metallometalloproteinases, which are actually control elements in terms of ECM turnover. And any type of dysregulated autophagy that you would see is going to impair collagen degradation and promote fibrosis. On the other side here, you will see uh, the general tendency, which is what I like to do. If there's a prescriptive component to a topic, it will show up in this tabular data here. And again, this is really where I think this will become a beneficial as a reference document, because these are the best, as far as I can tell, best indicated in terms of research, autophagy. Many of you are unfamiliar with trehalose, but if you know me, you know I've really been into it. It's a 2-carbon sugar that actually acts as an mTOR independent autophagy inducer. And so essentially, it's been shown in certain models to enhance autophagy. And cardiac fibrosis, I think, was the one that was best studied. There are certain agents in the course of this presentation that are going to show up again and again. And I sometimes wonder if, okay, is everything going to be all about curcumin and or something else? But I mean, that's really, I think, a reflection of, well, number one, curcumin's role is kind of central to a lot of the functions that are involved in fibrosis. But there are things that will show up consistently. And one of them, unsurprisingly, is cordyceps, which is a Chinese herb. It's a fungi, and it has effects here in terms of autophagy. And you will see later on, it has a bunch of other autophagy inducing other non-autophagic inducing effects in fibrosis that will be as interesting later on as well. So if you're really interested in autophagy, you can look at these agents as having a good starting point. There's no shortage of natural products that have been studied for autophagy, but I think these are generally what I would consider to be the 5 best studied with evidence. Now we go on to the star of the show, transforming growth factor beta 1. It's a protein that acts like a signaling boss. And again, you can see it over there I just kind of excerpted a portion of that diagram that's relevant to the topic. And so you'll see over there, there's its section of the pathway. It's critical, again, extracellular matrix, major player in controlling how it's built. It's produced large amounts as what's called a latent proprotein and activated by integrins, proteases, or reactive oxygen species. So it's easier to tell you the places in the body that you don't find transforming growth factor than it is to tell you the places that you do. It's everywhere. Anything that is going to be subject to injury as an organized organ or organoid or entity is going to have a representation of transforming growth factor beta. And it basically is a a significant player in the wound healing that we experience. It is tightly regulated under normal circumstances, but it is the key element that often shows up when we deal with an excessive amount of fibrosis. I won't go into a lot of the details here. These are put up for your own utilization later on as particular markers you may want to take off into your own explorations. As I said before, the metallometalloproteinases are a key element of the extracellular membrane. Integrins, which are becoming increasingly used in biologics by allopathic medicine as anti-inflammatories, used a lot in autoimmune diseases. Integrins also are another type of serum lectin. Again, things that will stimulate transforming growth factor, injury, hypoxia, all sorts of reactive oxygen species, cytokines, mechanical stress, metabolic, high glucose, diabetic fibrosis. So what's the other issue that comes up with fibrosis as a function of aging is it really is heightened in high glucose diabetic and pre-diabetic situations. And it's an epigenetic histone and DNA demethylation gives it at times an epigenetic effect, which is probably, again, the marriage of environmental insults with genomic propensities, which is really the nature of epigenetic changes that take place. The first pearl I share with you is on this page, which is that there's a strong association between homocysteine elevation, endothelial damage, and transforming growth factor activation. Your MTHFR patients should be considered pro-fibrotic at any stage in their lives. So ultimately, if you're dealing with this as a patient, or if you're dealing with this as a physician, if you are experiencing, you do any sort of genetic testing, and you are coming up with people who have the MTHFR polymorphisms, you can consider them essentially in a pre-fibrotic or early fibrotic manifestation right then and there. There's a great literature on this as well. But it's an interesting marker because so many of us do pay attention to that in the course of other work that we do. Here's a list of natural transforming growth factor beta inhibitors. And again, my goal is not to go down the list ad infinitum, but rather to bring this here so you have these as reference materials when you download the handout. Curcumin, of course, one of the best evidence strength on this. It reduces fibrosis markers in renal liver models. Human trials have actually taken place where there was some improvements in inhibiting transforming growth factor in chronic kidney disease. And you'll see basically that, most of the things that we take for, well, just we file under chronic disease or fibrotic manifestations are the actual physical way that they present as the degenerative process in and of itself. It may have a nexus in any one number of different ways and causes, but when it boils down to it, the thing that's going to make it a degenerative disease is going to be the replacement of healthy parenchyma with fibrotic tissue of non-metabolic nature and a destruction of the architecture, which is more and more prone in things like the pulmonary models and the renal models, where the fibrotic process itself makes the proper function of the organ impossible. So we have, again, resveratrol, something I sometimes wonder about, because it seems to be good for everything, but there are some studies and there's some moderate basis to it. Do I recommend that, one look at just inhibiting tumor transforming growth factor? No, because there's a thing in systems biology called small world phenomenon. And you go into it blocking a centralized node highly associated with the disease process. And usually it just results in maybe a temporary inhibition of function, but most of the time the system will essentially find alternate ways of being able to express what it needs to express as part of its disease process. It's sort of like when you're on I-95 and you come to a complete halt and everybody tries to get on the exit so they can take Route 1. This is the nature of how things work. So going for a very centralized point of inhibition has benefit, but oftentimes is much better if it's integrated with a much more comprehensive approach that looks towards inhibiting the other extra elements that are part of the process, both upstream and downstream from the central player. Salvia is a Chinese herb, danshan, comes up a lot in the antifibrosis, and as does Scutularia bicalensis, again, mainly because, and this doesn't show up in here that much, but the mechanism behind the genes of BAK1 and cytochrome C are big functional elements in certain types of fibrosis. And Scutularia has well-known, the woganin in Scutularia is well known to have an effect there. So we're on to our second player. We have now the role of transforming growth factors and what are known as SMADs. I forget what this stands for. It's like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, some ridiculous genetic name that they made out of something. But SMADs are the element that gang up and head towards the nucleus, carrying the message you need to make more collagen. And this is the result of direct activation by the receptor, the tyrosine kinase receptor that's behind the transforming growth factor. And a key mechanism is SMAD signaling. And it says there at the bottom, once TGF rings the doorbell, the SMADs turn on by phosphorylation and give the SMADs a key to unlock the next step. So again, they gang up, as you can see them here in the green on the edge of the nucleus, and they form a complex. And in there, they actually turn on the make more collagen message, and that actually results in an activation of another thing called STAT3, another molecule. And STAT3 has a kind of a positive feedback loop, and that ultimately it is ringing the bell for SMADs. And as you remember before in the beginning, I said there's almost a completely independent mechanism that drives this, which is just inflammation in general, which we'll get to later. But that's what's missing. If the board went another 2 inches to the right, you would see all the inflammatory elements that were eventually winding up activating STAT3. And so STAT3 is almost like a thing that allows SMAD to go into almost like an almost endless loop. And so the interesting thing is that everything seems to have positive and negative aspects. Another SMAD, which is not represented in the drawing, SMAD7, actually has an inhibitory effect on the activation of SMADs. And there's actually some evidence that this is a promising target for developing therapeutics. So these are honorable mentions. SMAD7, endogenous brake on TGFB-driven fibrosis. Its loss is unchecked, increasing ECM deposition. Its restoration equals a potent antifibrotic strategy. And so over here, I've listed some of the natural products that have SMAD7 activation here. You can see Centellia, Astragalus, Andrographis, Salvia again, Epicatechin, Curcumin. These are all try to activate SMAD7, which is a control factor. The others here, fibroblast growth factor and Wnt signaling, these tend to be more pro-fibrotic, and they can be activated independently of the fibrotic pathway. Certainly, Wnt is involved in a lot of cardiovascular issues as well, especially through the cadherins, which are cell attachment factors. Again, in this case, blocking Wnt would be more of a potential target for antifibrosis than in case of SMAD7, where we would really want to pump it up. CEBP alpha is an interesting molecule. This is probably the most interesting from a therapeutic standpoint. It's being studied a lot now for basically liver fibrosis, and it does have actually a significant anti-fibrosis effect that actually works largely with peroxisomal PPARs, particularly PPAR gamma. So PPARs are part of our energy metabolism, the peroxisome peroxidator, I think they are. And there's a lot of natural products that are directly linked to their proper function, but I've listed 3 here that seem to have a strong, or at least a reasonable evidence basis: lion's mane, red clover, and brown seaweed. Wnt, again, I think the one that seems to be the best there was Scutellaria. So again, looking at it from a standpoint, you're starting to see that generally happy fibrosis is a pretty simple affair. You go injury, cells, platelets, TGF, get a couple of SMADs thrown in there, make a few fibroblasts, bump up the ECM, increase the collagen, get everything to heal. Maybe later on send a few cells around there to do a little snip and tuck, clean it up. But the pathological processes are much more complicated because there's many places where things can infer for themselves a role in the pathological process, which is actually significantly more complicated. And it's evidenced by the fact that really allopathic medicine has very few, if any, effective treatments for fibrosis. They just don't exist. And it's interesting that it's an incredibly active area of research right now. And interesting, we'll get to a few of the things that are coming out from the pharma end of things, but the reality is interesting in terms of the increasing realization in the part of even conventional medicine that we need to do something about fibrosis. You can talk all you want about, regeneration and all sorts of other things, but if you have an organ that's functioning at 20% because of fibrotic changes, and you can't find a way to reverse fibrosis, you're not going to be able to do much with anti-aging whatsoever. I mean, maybe, but there are some really cool things I'll talk about later. Almost sound like science fiction almost, but we'll get to that in a second. Everybody's got some familiar with hypoxia induction factor. This is like an alarm system in your mitochondria, and it's part of the, what's his name? The cancer guy with the sugar. I forget his name. Warburg. It's a big player in the Warburg pathways. But basically, once you have a activation of any sort of hypoxic events, and these can be from any sort of type of ROS, any sort of changes that involve changes to phosphorylation, it sends out like a warning, and that's one of the tripwire type warnings is a hypoxic state. It's interesting because the effect of in addition to activating transforming growth factor, hypoxia induction factor activates vascular endothelial growth factor, VEGF, and it was a combination of VEGF and I believe several other factors, which became the first approved treatment for fibrosis, a drug called OFEV or nintedanib, but it's a very underwhelming drug. So here we are again, looking at the big picture, and again, you see here the players that I've described in some detail. Now I'm going to talk about a few more. You'll notice on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a PDE and a link to cyclic AMP. PDE is phosphodiesterase, and in particular, phosphodiesterase is something we'll talk about. Phosphodiesterase 4 is a player that was just part of a newly approved drug for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. But again, I think we may have a second clinical pearl for naturopaths in that arena that we might be able to use in the realm of managing the early fibrotic patient or the fibrotic prone patient. STAT3 was the activator that was turned on by inflammation that wound up ramping up the SMADs. It was kept telling the SMADs, keep making collagen, keep making collagen, keep making collagen. And this is turned on by the inflammaging state. Again, I wanted to just get this out there because the feedback loop is such that once a person has a pro-inflammatory diathesis, a pro-fibrotic diathesis, inflammation may be sufficient to just keep that going, may be sufficient to prolong the messaging and prolong the fibrotic process, which begs the question in the opposite direction, is that if one can remove inflammation and thereby remove STAT3 activation of the feedback cycle with SMAD, which is just keeping that internucleic message going to create more and more collagen, that may be the most generalized approach of anti-inflammatory diets, low lectin diets, low allergen diets, those kind of things may be a good bedrock upon which to structure an approach, a proactive approach. I mean, it's probably good for everybody, but again, and everybody will have some, believe me, if you get old, you fibrose. It's as simple as that. TNIC, which is one that I measured before, is being it's like an image booster. Like right now, I'm in my basement, but my modem is upstairs on the first floor, and I can't use that particular wireless node down here. The signal's not strong enough. So I have something called a mesh booster down here that allows me to boost that signal from the first floor down here that I could have on the computer that I use here. And that's what TNIC is like. It's sort of like a booster for the network. And what it does is when it kicks in, just like STAT3, it does this activation of SMAD, make more, more fibrosis, more ECM, more fibroblasts. The interesting thing about TNIC is there's a drug in phase 2 here called rentercib. Where did they come up with these names? Rentocertib. Great. In phase 2 by a company called Insilico, and it actually increased expiration volume. It was so in pulmonary fibrosis, you just see a gradual decrease in pulmonary function. And the only approved drugs at this point up until now, their only claim to fame was that they slowed that down. Okay. This drug, which just got out of phase 2, is unique in that it showed some actual improvements in pulmonary function. And probably the most secondary thing that I thought was interesting was that the molecule was discovered by artificial intelligence, which, I mean, now they can run the numbers and come up with this stuff. It's a very interesting area. And this is now ready to go into phase 3. The nice thing about this is it can be combined with other drugs, and they seem to get along fine. But maybe here's the other pearl that I wanted to share with you. It's this. Many of you are familiar with it, Coleus forskolin, or forskolin. I never can pronounce that. Forskolin. And it pretty plant. And what do we know about it? It is a activator of adenyl cyclase, and that results in activation of adenosine monophosphate, increases levels of adenosine monophosphate. Now, why is that important? Remember I said before that one of the elements that's involved, and you can see it over here, that little pink box, is phosphodiesterase. And inflammation activates phosphodiesterase. And phosphodiesterase is a couple of different ones. I think it's 1 through 4. The one that's being studied, which was just released in something called the Fibroneer study, was a PDE4 inhibitor that is the major phosphodiesterase molecule in pulmonary fibrosis, but it's also involved in virtually all forms of fibrosis. Now, why is that important? Well, if you inhibit phosphodiesterase, you inhibit phosphodiesterase's ability to inhibit the activation and production of cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP has a calm down, serenity now signal for fibroblasts. So if you wind up inhibiting the inhibitor, or just like they say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, we wind up in the Fibroneer study, which was just released. They were going for a home run. They probably got a single, but it does have an effect in terms of, again, slowing down progression. They might have seen a slight improvement in pulmonary function, but the most important thing was that the drug could be well combined with the other pharmaceuticals. There were no interactions or anything. But what's the thing about Coleus that's so unique? Its major claim to fame is it increases cyclic AMP. So if we were to basically look at how we could send a serenity now signal to the fibroblasts to make less collagen and don't, by the way, turn into myofibroblasts. What myofibroblasts are the atomic fibroblasts. You know, they're the ones that they just go nuts. So again, another interesting opportunity here. Can we look at inhibiting drugs that basically block phosphodiesterase? And can we use agents that increase adenyl cyclase, consequently cyclic AMP, and get the effect of perhaps producing a better level of cyclic AMP in addition to allowing the cell to not have that inhibitory message. So again, we go into the chart. What are the evidence that we have? Well, forskolin is high evidence. There's no question that this plant basically increases cyclic AMP. You can get a 5 to 10-fold increase in cyclic AMP in cellular models, okay? But there's others. I remember when I took my first pharmacology course at Bastyr back in 1982, the pharmacology instructor said that you guys need to have some phosphodiesterase inhibition. We didn't even know what he was talking about. But he was saying, yeah, you should go home and get some coffee. In essence, basically, caffeine is well-known inhibitor of phosphodiesterase. And so part of perhaps one of the major effects that caffeine produces is an increase in cyclic AMP. Others, well, curcumin, which seems to do everything to everybody, and then others. I'm not familiar with Zembrin, but I put it here because it had some evidence behind it, and bitter orange. But again, the take-home message here is we may very well have a very useful agent in the management of early stage fibrosis by simply the process of increasing cyclic AMP production. And we can then use other tools to block that by inhibiting the phosphodiesterase as well. So maybe you need to drink some coffee and maybe take some Coleus as well. Prostacyclin is odd because most arachidonic acid derivative molecules are inflammatory. But as you know, we know prostacyclin is actually an inflammatory paradox. It reduces SMAD, which is great because we don't get that intercellular message telling it to make more collagen. By the way, turn yourself into a myofibroblast. And increases, metal MMP9, matrix metalloproteinases. They're like a Janus-like molecule. You need enough in order to have fibrosis proceed normally, but not so much that it starts to cause dysregulation. So it's not a great target, but anything that can have an effect on it with regard to the actions of inhibiting collagen synthesis at the same time, kind of a nice thing. There is, again, some evidence that these are being investigated for some drug development. There are two up front that are already I think already beyond phase 3 in clinicals. The second one there, Baraprost, is being looked at as an antifibrotic in chronic kidney disease. But again, here's another thing to take away from this, and that this is probably not your NSAID patient with regard to the best things you could use on a regular basis. So again, you're prone, or you're developing fibrosis patient, think, be careful with the Advils and things. And then basically, again, we're looking at other agents here. I thought olive oil was interesting, that it had the improvements that were able to be shown in aortic prostacyclin production. I guarantee you, we're almost done at the molecular biology part. LPA is a chemical that is, again, involved in the fibrosis process. It's again, it doesn't play in the canonical way of dysregulated fibrosis, but it's a player. And again, it is a target that may have some benefit. It is, again, an activator of migration, activation, resistance to apoptosis. So these are phospholipids. These are actually there are use for these in other places besides fibrosis, but there are some benefits perhaps to us looking at these in terms of other elements that could be utilized in sort of a more of a complicated or complex approach. I was aware that one of the cardiovascular effects of magnolia, magnolol, is through this mechanism. And sulforaphanes, which I was unaware of, had this effect as well. Again, I'm really just trying to broaden the molecular biology part. And believe it or not, I've had to be selective here, because a lot of it is beyond my abilities to keep it in my head. So I tried to keep, as much as possible, the ability to work to the center of the problem and minimize the peripheral elements, but also too to make sure that the ones that are significant got at least a passing glance. And again, here's the real bottom line. It's the extracellular matrix, maintained tissues, myofibroblasts. These are the ones that gain extra powers, the ability to cause constriction, contraction, like you would see typically with scar formation. And typically in healthy healing, these tend to die off after the job is done through apoptosis. So are they, is part of this process apoptosis resistance in a maybe an overdone myofibroblast, that we say? They stick around and they just keep making more and more scar tissue. So apoptosis, you can look at a variety of products that intend to encourage apoptosis that are part of the natural. The classic, of course, is Scutellaria, Chinese scoot. Things that basically work on BAX, BCL1, any of the apoptosis genes that are part of the cell makeup. Anything that acts with cytochrome C is also a potential candidate for apoptosis. There's another plant which is I used a lot when I was in clinical practice, which was Gossypium, Gossypium sempervirens, cotton plant. Gossipol is a very, very significant inducer of apoptosis. So is there a role in terms of being able to encourage myofibroblasts to head back towards a more well-behaved fibroblastic profile by inducing apoptosis that should have occurred as part of a more properly regulated fibrotic process? Possibly. Again, here are your basic antifibrotics and fibrinolytics. These you should be fairly well aware of. Nattokinase, lumbrokinase. The evidence is not too bad. I think the evidence is best on for dysregulated fibrosis is nattokinase and lumbrokinase. Surprisingly, there was some studies on ginkgo and bromelain. Well, bromelain is no big surprise, although we didn't really see any great studies there. Two small RCTs. The interesting thing with nattokinase is that there are human studies, and they show not an insignificant amount of anti-fibrotic activity. Again, we here looking at the landscape. Okay, try to find a part of your body that's not prone to have a fibrotic process. Doesn't happen. Anywhere you get old, anywhere you get hurt, anywhere something goes wrong, something dysregulated, if it's going to impact the organ, if it's going to have a macroscopic appearance, a manifestation, it's going to go fibrotic. And that's really where the pathological process, the day-to-day pathological process that we see as physicians, okay, that I've got chronic kidney disease, stage 3. I've got pulmonary fibrosis. I've got fibrosis of Crohn's disease, for instance, is intestinal fibrosis. So we see a lot of manifestations. And I said before in the very beginning, they will share an overwhelming amount with the molecular elements that I just previously described. Most of those molecular elements will be things that will be shared between the organ systems. Some will be more than others, and some will have elements that are different, perhaps maybe having occasionally things that are even unique to themselves. So let's take a look at some of these as they play out in the organ systems. Renal fibrosis, the biggie, okay, other than pulmonary fibrosis. Chronic kidney disease, kidney fibrosis, virtually all compartments. It's the most common underlying cause, no big surprise there. Hypertension, diabetes, inflammatory conditions, glomerulonephritis, lupus, anything autoimmune, it's going to play out in the kidney parenchyma. It's going to cause fibrosis. Again, before, MTHFR is the one to watch again. The SGLT2 inhibitors slow progression. I couldn't tell you whether they do it through a fibrosis mechanism or not, but I think the major element there is probably more through more of a glucose regulating element, but they are effective if given over the long term at being able to blunt a bit of this. But I think at one point I read as a young doctor that by the time a person's 70 years old, they're running on about 20% of their kidneys. Okay, so you're winding up with a age-related decline in kidney function. And the takeaway here is a lot of it also plays out uniquely in the kidney because of the role of the mineralocorticoid receptor, okay, which is the major regulator of gene expression in the kidneys and the lungs as well. And when this is aberrant, it becomes profibrotic and pro-inflammatory and interstitial fibrosis and tubular atrophy. And there, aldosterone is the major contributor, which induces E to MT transition, epithelial to mesenchymal transition. So again, where are we with mineralocorticoid influences? The major player here, aldosterone, activates fibroblasts, amplifies TGF, thank God it's Friday, TGFB1, cortisol. So there's an axis right there if you really wanted to integrate metabolic elements like aldosterone in combination with stress-related or circadian-related elements like cortisol. Other things basically that showed some elements on the mineralocorticoid effects in renal fibrosis were jackfruit, which I've always been interested in because it is a lectin in there called jacqueline, which has some interesting effects on lymphocytes, but apparently doesn't enter any of these actions. But there are some elements here that apparently this fruit, which believe it or not, is the basis of why juicy fruit gum tastes like juicy fruit gum is thanks to jackfruit. Interesting fruit, by the way. And the diuretic spironolactone. Okay, so the elements here are aldosterone, cortisol, not so good. And there's probably other things we could be looking at here. And here they are. Things that basically reduce, again, these were the fibrosis score reductions by decreasing things like TGF and collagen 1. And we see that there are, now these are rats, okay? So, you know, for what it's worth. But, you know, there's mechanistic evidence for this. You know, is it going to go on to humans? I doubt it, but we have access to these things. We are knowledgeable in their pharmacokinetics. We know how they can be combined effectively. And we are in the business of playing the long game. And so looking at it from that perspective, I don't see any reason why a decently indicated natural product would perhaps not necessarily the greatest evidence basis, but a consistent evidence basis is something that could be just dispensed with because it didn't suit the needs of the ultimate skeptic. Okay. And here we are with obviously things we know that are going to be effective in these situations. And again, it shows up with here something berberine, which is actually, I believe it's in a phase 2 in renal fibrosis as well. So again, you will live long enough, you'll have 20% of your kidneys, and the 80% will be taken up with fibrotic material. Hepatic fibrosis, I mean, let's talk fatty liver disease, 25% of the adults worldwide. Viral infections, autoimmune hepatitis rather, you know, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Interesting thing is that unlike most of the other organ fibrosis, hepatic fibrosis is a bit reversible. And but it has to be treated early and the injury can't have progressed too far. So, you know, get them on anything antiviral, immune activation, get them off alcohol, have them lose weight, make the lifestyle changes. Again, these are some of the things that come to mind. Not surprisingly, milk thistle. The liver fibrosis trial showed an antifibrotic precedent. And TUDCA showed it was probably had the strongest evidence basis. Matrine, again, from Sephora japonica. Matrine's an alkaloid and has to be respected for that. But I've used it very successfully in clinical practice. And again, this has some effectiveness here as well. And I think really a combination of this with lifestyle factors, anti-inflammatory diet, other types of strategies addressing fibrosis from a generalized standpoint, like we talked about at the molecular level, and then going to the organ and looking at the specifics of the organ-specific fibrotic issues allows us to zero in a little bit and maybe, just maybe, be able to expect a bit more out of our gentle medicines. Cardiac fibrosis. Well, and you know, heart attacks, when the tissue puts itself back together again, there's going to be fibrotic tissue. The interesting thing, of course, is that in cardiac fibrosis, it's probably a good thing because you know you're taking care of being able to hold that muscle together. Here's a link to the TMAO that everybody talks about. You know, the choline derivative that is supposed to make you a vegetarian. Except that TMAO is also a molecular chaperone that nobody seems to talk about. So it's real important in terms of twisting your glycans and glycoproteins and glycolipids into the proper shape in your endoplasmic reticulum. But then again, that doesn't have anything to do with being a vegetarian, I guess. But anyway, TMAO promotes cardiac fibrosis. So there's a direct link here with fibroblast differentiation into myofibroblasts. So really what TMAO does in cardiac fibrosis is it kind of puts the myofibroblasts in steroid mode. And remember, these are like the killer fibroblasts. These are the ones who just make huge amounts of useless extracellular matrix. It's gooey, doesn't do anything, and there's too much of it. Again, what are the things that are going to get you in this kind of shape? Well, a cardio-pathological lifestyle, hypertension, and just getting old, I guess. So again, looking at it from here, what do? Improve the kidneys. Omega-3 shows some evidence here. Diet, probiotics, trehalose. Interesting. 2% of trehalose in drinking water reduces cardiac fibrosis in rats. But again, the next step up, what would be the next step would be to do a, phase 2, which would be, its whole purpose most of the time is to just be able to say, we didn't kill anybody with this stuff. Okay, but we know from most of these things, from years of study, that these things are fundamentally safe. So they could theoretically be moved on to phase 3 and then subsequently to clinicals, but that's costs money. Brain and nervous tissue fibrosis. Well, this is usually a response to stroke or neurodegenerative disease, like cardiac fibrosis. It's a good thing. Multiple sclerosis is characterized by fibrotic scars, so does stroke. No RCTs for reversal. All data shows prevention or slowing. Treatment is best in early phase. And again, here are some things that came up as being reasonably efficacious with some evidence basis behind them. Most of these, again, occasionally we see human studies here. Lion's mane, of course, we're all familiar with its effects in terms of brain physiology and things. So it's no surprise. But it's interesting that so much of the, reverse engineer that thought, it's so much that interesting that some of the things we know are good for this organ and turn out to be antifibrotic in that organ. But maybe we never asked that question before. Right? Myelofibrosis. This is interesting because a lot of myelofibrosis develops as a concomitant of fibrosis in other organs. Like, for instance, in pulmonary fibrosis, it's not uncommon to see a concomitant myofibrosis. And the reason, as you'll see, has to do with where they link together at the telomere level. Secondary myelofibrosis is myelodysplastic. And again, here's the link to short telomere. Chronic myeloid leukemia, radiation therapy, and medications. So again, looking at it, we see our inevitable favorite, curcumin. And I guess if I was to make a presentation as an allopath, I would stop complaining about why curcumin shows up everywhere and start complaining about why prednisone shows up everywhere. But since this isn't about being an allopath, we're going to just complain about why curcumin shows up everywhere. But if you think about it, almost everything in a chart, if this was an allopathic chart, almost every one of these charts would have had prednisone in it. Gastrointestinal fibrosis, ECM accumulation in the GI tract, complications of inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. Unlike fibrosis in the liver and the heart, once the fibrosis in the digestive tract, it doesn't reverse. And it goes on to, it can be stopped, but what you got, you got. And again, that's really an element with regards to, I've certainly seen that in Crohn's disease with regard to strictures and consequences of the chronic diseases. The fibrosis is just a factor of the architecture of the organ at that point. Berberine, again, Boswellia, first time that showed up here. It's a reasonably reliable anti-inflammatory. And again, they have studied probiotics. I mean, there is some evidence there. So again, looking at it from the perspective of things that would be part of a digestive specific approach to fibrosis, I would be hearkening back to my molecular basis of it, looking to see what are going to be the ones that are going to be processes I might be able to think about interacting with, and then moving down to the specifics of the organ specific elements to the fibrotic process. There's a big connection between the microbiome and fibrosis. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I'm not sure necessarily, other than doing a microbiome analysis and figuring out ways you can do things to change stuff. But here are the links between having too much of something or not enough of something and the various types of organ-specific fibrosis. So again, we see a lot of, if you break, down things to phyla, you have your Firmicutes and Bacteroides. And in most cases, you see a decreased amount of the more Bacteroides-based species and things that have to do with that. And again, this is why I consider this presentation so much more a reference work than a soft shoe of lighthearted material here. This is things hopefully you can refer to later on if you plan to come to grips with this. And you can not, but it's going to be there. Fibrotic process, it's going to be an element, a concomitant element in any non-acute medical situation you encounter, period. And then the granddaddy of them all, the Achilles heel of your humble presenter, lung fibrosis. I was given the diagnosis of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis and had the pleasure of rediscovering myself that the median survival was 3 to 5 years. Being somewhat of a stoic, believe it or not, I went to sleep that night. But secondary pulmonary fibrosis is, you see a lot with sarcoidosis, rheumatoid arthritis. These people will go on and get what's normally called interstitial fibrosis, pulmonary interstitial fibrosis. And that ultimately, there's other things that are part of it that are, besides the nature of what they have. So you see this interstitial is not uncommon in your rheumatoid patients. You can see it sometimes in drug-induced situations. Big factor is environmental occupational. You see this in people who work in the automotive business. Believe it or not, baking seems to be a strong association with flour and fibrosis, pulmonary fibrosis, working with certain types of flours. The old days, people had silicosis. I remember working on houses in the 80s. Nobody wore masks, And it's so funny because I watch all the Gen Zs on YouTube, and they're fixing a pipe underneath their sink and they got a mask on. And it's like, okay, you don't have to worry that much about things. But again, you see this. I was taught pulmonary fibrosis, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis was so rare, I wasn't going to see it, okay, in clinical practice. And it's classified as a rare disease. However, it's really not that rare. There's probably about 200,000 people who are currently dealing with some form of pulmonary fibrosis, either the interstitial form or the idiopathic pulmonary. And that number is increasing. A major driver of pulmonary fibrosis was the Delta variant of COVID. This had a real predilection for inflammatory changes to the lung. And they had a classic ground glass appearance, which was obviously a fibrotic event. So that was the driving factor behind a lot of the fibrosis. And of course, the other major one is cystic fibrosis, which is a different type of fibrosis. It's under the control of a particular gene haplotype, and strangely enough, is being close to being cured by gene therapy at this point. Matter of fact, the availability of lungs for transplantation is considerably better now because the effective drug treatment for cystic fibrosis essentially pulled the rug out from the market. And so essentially, what a lung transplant that one might have had to wait a year for, one can now get in 3 to 4 weeks. That was the degree because you had kids with cystic fibrosis who were getting 3 lung transplants in the course of their life. And that was still a short life. And so now they're getting, if they get effective gene therapy early in life, they're being told that they can live a normal lifespan. So it's amazing the change that went on with that. But it did actually change the market for transplantation of lung material. Most causes airborne, obviously, mining, smoking. You know, the population is much more aware of the impact of aerosolized irritants that go into the lungs than my generation was, and certainly the generations before that were even worse. You know, you remember these people coming out of the mines, you know, their face is completely black, and it's like, well, okay, if your face is black, I wonder what your lungs look like. Anyway, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis is considered to be the poster child of pulmonary fibrosis. It's interesting because there's a genetic component to it. It causes a particular type of uh, shadowing in the lung. You wind up with a particular type of appearance. Matter of fact, the ground glass appearance is considered classic. It moves typically, the way it was described to me is if you look at COPD in terms of how pulmonary function decreases, it's kind of like a linear slope downwards. But with pulmonary fibrosis, it's a staircase effect. Like, in other words, you spend a lot of time at a certain level, and then you just drop to the next level. And you spend a certain amount of time there, and then you drop to the next level. So it doesn't take long to go from being reasonably in control and functional to being a medical emergency. And that's really one of the keynotes here. It progresses and the scarring certainly occurs in a very, very specific and rapid form. I made mention of VEGF2 and ultimately the effect, and that there's again, the drug at the bottom here, Entidanib, OFEV. I took that. It had no effect whatsoever. You know, the only thing that it did was, I think it cost me $4,000 for 1 month. But after that, the government kicked in and paid for the rest of it. But it was ineffective. But I think probably my fibrosis was too far gone at that point. In pulmonary fibrosis, though, it does have an effect of um, activating the angiofibrotic switch. And so there's and remember what I said, in order for fibrosis to occur, you have to bleed a little. And so in essence, that early injury that triggers the fibrotic process has to have at least a micro hemorrhage of sort, because the whole symphony of cellular song and dance involves platelet activation and neutrophil nets and all sorts of other things that have to take place. And again, these are the ones that are been studied the most. Again, silymarin probably shows the strongest evidence basis in the natural world. The OFEV, again, people take it. It has a lot of digestive complications. I never suffered from them, but nonetheless, I didn't come out of it with any extension. The best they can promise is a very slight slowing down of the fibrotic process. It doesn't stop it, and it doesn't reverse it. These are the ones that are currently available. I mentioned the 2 new ones, the third one down there, which is the phosphodiesterase inhibitor, and then the one underneath it, which is the one in phase 2 that was developed by artificial intelligence, that is the inhibitor of TNIC. Interesting thing with most forms of pulmonary fibrosis, there's always an element of GERD involved. And I think the theory is that the GERD produces an aerosolized hydrochloric acid cloud that goes up the esophagus is put into the nasal pharynx and then sort of aspirated into the lungs. And so the other thing too is to look at managing esophageal and forms of, and there is a form of GERD called esophageal and nasopharyngeal GERD that doesn't even produce the characteristic stomach burning. It takes place entirely in the upper GI tract, and it has only very slight sensations of disquietude, but none of the, oh my God, I need to reach for the antacid kind of stuff that you normally think of with GERD. The other treatments, of course, are oxygen, which does, allow a person to function. The major thing that has been a factor, at least in many cases, is pulmonary rehab. And this actually is important, especially if the person is being set up for transplantation, because transplantation involves a kind of a Goldilocks formula where you have to be sick enough to get a transplant and healthy enough to survive what they're about to do to you, which is to run you over with a bus. The surgery is extensive. The utilization of pharmaceuticals is extensive. You're on immunosuppressives. So we see there's a big difference in people who get fit as part of their process of getting ready for transplantation. Once you get out of transplantation, you are going to be physical, and the post-transplant benefits are astronomical in terms of improvements in endurance and things. It also improves lung volume and lung function as well. And of course, the only real quote unquote cure for these types of pulmonary fibrosis conditions is lung transplantation. But there's really not a cure. You're really substituting one illness for another. You're breathing like I'm talking to you right now, and I'm on room air. But you take a lot of immunosuppressive drugs and all sorts of other things that are part of getting. Matter of fact, you have to take things that are involved in controlling for the other things you take. So you have to have a certain awareness that you will be doing this. But on the other hand, it's nice to be on this side of the grass. So I think almost anybody who goes through the process, and I counsel a lot of people who are heading for transplantation and they're scared, I mean, it's a normal human feeling, but the end result of not doing it is something to be much more scared of. If you do auscultation, the thing you're going to be on the lookout for are crackles. Okay. I don't think I can play you a crackle, but if you go to YouTube and put in lung crackles, you can listen to sounds. It sounds like cellophane being crumpled or a bubbling sound. All you need to do at that point is rule out pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure. And if you are at that point, you should be looking at probably pulse oxes in the patient, maybe in the low 90s. If they do a 6-minute walk test, they go below 87. You've got a definitive diagnosis at that point. And you've just done humanity a great thing. If you can find these types of early stage pulmonary fibrosis type situations, you're going to make a big difference in their quality of life. It's easier to treat in the early stages. It's easier to delay progression in the early stages. The other thing you want to be on the lookout for is finger clubbing. And that's an association that you see there with the Shamroth window, which is that you see a little diamond shape when you put the fingers together in that little space at the bottom of the fingernail. And again, the interesting thing about clubbing is post-transplant, it goes away, which I thought was kind of interesting. Oh, there's a crack and slug. Can you hear that? These are coarse crackles. The other classic sign is called honeycombing, and this is typically seen on X-ray. What happens is the alveolar sacs essentially degenerate into massively coalesced craters, essentially. And again, these are end-stage manifestations. When you see ground glass and extensive honeycombing, you're looking at a person who's probably got about maybe 20%, 25% lung volume. If that person hasn't figured out a way that they need oxygen, they're probably gasping as they're trying to just do housework. I mean, by that time, the person's lucky if they can make it from the bedroom to the kitchen. So anyway, now we're on to the other things here. Some of these I tried. Some of them probably did have some effect. N-acetylcysteine, very effective with regard to utilizing that for glutathione. I did do nebulized glutathione. Maybe it helped. I think it helped with my breathing a little bit. Like I said, when you have that staircase de-evolvement of, at that point, none of these things really, the illness has got a life of its own at that point. And you're looking at it's like a drowning man. No, it's like a dying man who like is in the restaurant and pulls the tablecloth as he falls down and ruins everybody else's meal. It's like the illness just assumes a kind of it just takes everything with it. These are things that I felt that worked well for me. CoQ10, I found, and like I said before, I did N-acetylcysteine. I also used cordyceps, and I think that had some benefit as well. So again, we look at this in terms of what are the factors. It's environmental, inflammatory, post-infectious, genetic, and epigenetic. I mean, it's got everything you can imagine from the pathogenesis standpoint is going to play in here. And again, it's going to be the injuries. It's going to be the green there, you got everything happening nicely. And the red there, you have, well, everything starts to go crazy. And then you get fibrosis, and then all those things are going to kick in, and they're just going to keep playing back and forth. As I said before, fibrosis is genetic. And my father died of pulmonary fibrosis several years ago. And it's probably about 20% of the cases are genetic. 30% have a heritable component. And most of the time, they're linked to mutations in telomere-related genes. There's an interesting gene that you can check as a risk factor for IPF or pulmonary fibrosis in general in the MUC5B gene, this particular SNP, RS3570590, which is reported by Ancestry, and I think reported by Self-Decode. So there's another one that gives you an opportunity to see if there's a capacity there for any sort of heritability component. But it turns out that actually, even when you factor in genetics, which is strong, you still need to have something environmentally that brings it on as well. And it could be infections. Again, we talked about other things that come into play there, aerosolized toxins, minerals, anything, paints, urethanes, any of this. So the genetic part is important, but the thing that kind of makes it, brings it to life is going to be a combination of the genetics and the environment. And again, we see now with the interesting thing now is what was COVID, like 2019 and 2020, and that was the worst variant. That was the Delta. That was the one that caused a lot of pulmonary. And now we're seeing that these cases are heading towards lung transplantation because the fibrotic process that was initiated by the SARS virus is now at the point where the 3 to 5 year window that we would see with other fibrotic conditions is essentially applying to the COVID patients as well. Here's an interesting thing, though. So people with pulmonary fibrosis have this short telomere syndrome, and there can be a variety of different genes that can be looked at. I had what's called a PARN variant, which was part of making the telomerase element there that you can see down here at the other side, the TERT complex. It's interesting. Are you familiar that they just worked up this 114-year-old woman who died? And they concluded that she had really short telomeres. So again, if you look at telomeres, it's probably relevant here, but I think that you get to 114 years old, and when they do an analysis on you, it turns out that you have reasonably short telomeres. Some people can argue that they just have a lot of telomere attrition, but they're really good at putting it back. But the end result is that it doesn't manifest as a long telomere. It simply manifests as a short telomere that stays short, but constantly gets replaced. But the most interesting thing about this 114-year-old woman was that she ate 3 yogurts a day and a whole lot of olive oil. And I thought that was a whole lot more interesting than her short telomeres. Matter of fact, when I was talking with the geneticist over at Brigham, I said, you know, the hell with the short telomeres. I'm going to eat 3 yogurts a day. Anyway, so you can do some testing for this. If people want more information on it, I can certainly bring that to your attention. We know epigenetics are a big factor, maybe more in terms of things like liver and pulmonary. The elements in cardiac, their histone deacetylase activity, which is really a very poorly understood mechanism of epigenetic activity. We know histone methylation, regular classic methylation that you would see in CPG island methylation or diffuse methylation that you would see when you drink your green tea, for instance. That's understood. You know, the methyl groups act like brakes. They control gene expression. Histone acetylation is complicated because it's really talking about altering the expandability of the chromosome to allow for reading and activation of the reading apparatus and things. So again, I can't tell you much about that from an expert standpoint, but they know that there's methylation differences in a number of the known renal fibrosis genes as well. So what do we look at that is, you know, what did we talk about when we talked about MTHFR? So final thoughts. Ascertain as possible the probable degree of fibrosis that's accompanying your patient's generalized or organ-specific chronic disease. Early fibrosis never manifests as fibrosis because these changes are going to be they're going to be too small to be discrete. So you have to then substitute some kind of a reference frame. Is there a person fibrosis prone? Okay, granted that everybody's fibrosis prone, but are there going to be things in your patient management that are going to ask you to be thinking about fibrosis as a process that's going to have to be part of their management? And that's going to be things that you're going to have to look at. Things like genomics, MTHFR, family history, lifestyle, toxic exposure, proactive therapies, lifestyle changes ASAP. Again, you can modulate fibrosis probably and successfully with some of our agents in the early scenarios. And at a certain point, they just have to be looked at in terms of where you go in the overt and advanced scenarios. And if necessary, you know, you may have to use one of the more technical solutions to the problem in end stage. But if you manifest in your thinking that what are going to be the things that are going to constitute how you frame a clinical case in your mind. Everybody talks about the gut, okay? Gut, gut, gut. I'm going to suggest that you keep gut, but you add fibrosis because you will have gut as your instrument and your realm of reference, and fibrosis is your indicator of where you need to put your therapeutic emphasis going forward. And like I used to say in sailing school at the bottom there, it's easier to stay dry than it is to get dry. And that's really true. You know, I mean, maybe it's just simple anti-inflammaging. Maybe it's the activation of looking at things from a perspective of methylation or MTHFR prone or adenyl cyclase, how much cyclic AMP, hypoxia, mitochondrial health. These are going to be things that are going to play directly or indirectly. Once you move into the conveyor belt of having a fibrotic patient, then you have to start examining Okay, what are the unique characteristics of fibrosis in that specific organ? And then how can I superimpose my molecular biology management on top of the characteristics that are unique to that organ? A little bit of an addendum, nothing big, dealing with transplant and pre-transplant patients. You'll get them, eventually you'll get them, and you want to be aware, and I'm not going to go through this, I promise you, but the standard anti-rejection medicines are classic, the classic threesome, tacrolimus, mycophenolate, and prednisone. Now, tacrolimus took the place of cyclosporin a couple of years back, and it's typically a it's a toxic drug that has to be within what's called a trough, and that trough has to be very narrow. It has to be high enough to be able to exert an anti-rejection effect and low enough to not destroy everything in your kidneys and all sorts of other things. Mycophenolate, big increase of certain cancers, as you'll see when we look at the methodology here. Prednisone, I don't need to lecture you guys on what that does. And one of the interesting things is a test that I'm part of a research project on that looks at a test called AlloSure as a way of identifying rejection-prone situations. So for instance, in the case of pulmonary fibrosis, the gold standard is bronchoscopies, regular bronchoscopies to be looking for signs of rejection. And then there's other constitutional signs too, fever, those kind of things. But by that time, you're looking at rejection. And there's two types of rejection in lungs. There's acute rejection, and then there's chronic rejection. And acute rejection is almost treated at home now. They just give you a huge amount of steroids and send you home. Chronic rejection is the bad one. That's where you get the bronchiolitis, obliterans, and that's an end stage type of thing. That's going to be the we call in chemistry the rate limiting step for your life will be that. So, end stage rejection. But AlloSure is cool because it's a blood test that looks for SNPs from the donor organ in your bloodstream, indicating that the tissue has been damaged by the rejection process and as such is releasing cell-free DNA into the bloodstream. And since the donor organ is genetically different than the receiver, you can test for specific areas and see a specific different SNP pattern at those places. And so this actually detects cell-free DNA and is an indicator of allograft injury and potential rejection. It's currently used a lot in kidney, and it's just moving into some of the other rejections as well. Just a note about the actions of tacrolimus here, which is the major anti-rejection medicine. It's what's called a calcineurin inhibitor, and that basically plays out in this diagram where we see that the activation of the antigen-presenting cell to the T cell results in a calcium influx, which activates calmodulin, which activates calcineurin, and then that basically goes to an element called NFAT, and that goes to the gene, and that produces all the anti-inflammatory elements. That is the inflammatory elements, rather. And so by blocking here, when we see the second pink box, calcineurin, we actually interfere with that as well. And so, of course, drugs being drugs, calcineurin's used in a lot of places. And so you will see changes in kidney function, all sorts of things. I mean, interesting that this drug causes you to have to watch out for your magnesium levels as well. Mycophenolate is the second major anti-rejection medicine. It's a little easier to understand. It basically is where that red X is in the square. It blocks a certain point of the cell cycle that is having to do with the activation of that particular Treg cell, and then it interferes because of that with its production of all the appropriate cytokines. These are things I would feel comfortable telling people to at least have as a starter pack in managing people. these are things that, as far as I can tell by study and analysis, don't get into cytochrome hot water with the anti-rejection meds, may have quality of life improvements. You know, a lot of these things have to do, obviously, with consequences of the medication, calcium loss from the steroids, magnesium loss from the tacrolimus, other things having to do with the effects of the transplant itself, and in terms of modulation. And omega-3 is well regulated. You know, I like coenzyme Q10 a lot, mainly because it has nice effects on something called pyrotosis, which is another element in the inflammatory process. And so these are things I feel like, you know, if you really were going to be managing a post-transplant patient, you could obviously be doing other things, but these are where I would say is a good starter pack. And again, the other thing too with people on transfusion, transplant, post-transplant world, perpetually monitoring blood sugar, because all these anti-rejection medicines, in particular the steroids, you're looking at a lot of blood sugar issues. And what does that do? Well, that brings on the chronic kidney disease as well. And so you have here the accumulated knowledge of things that have been studied to have an effect on blood sugar metabolism, including some of the natural product ones. And that's something you can spend a little time with. Finally, as I tell you, there's kind of a Buck Rogers thing, which is, believe it or not, in the works. It's called decellularization, recellularization. And the idea here is that you can take like an organ, in this case, they maybe take it from an animal, completely decellularize it down to the ECM, and then recellularize it with the recipient's germ cells. And they're at the point, I think, where they got a decellularized, recellularized lung to last, I believe, almost 20 hours. And whereas this is going to be something way beyond the scope of what we would talk about here, it tells you that we have a way potentially forward that will get us away from having to deal with a rejection conundrum. And my feeling here is I don't see, I won't be around for this, obviously, but some smart guy with a 10,000 IQ is going to figure out how to 3D print the scaffolding extracellular matrix, and you won't even have to decellularize at that point. You just put it in a broth of recipient germ cells and let them go to work, and there you go. So, I mean, this opens up a process of being able to replenish organs that have clearly gone to the end of their service life, which may be not necessarily for the billionaire who's looking to live to be 140 or 150, but offers promise to people. 10,000 people last year died of pulmonary fibrosis who could have technically qualified for lung transplant. So again, this is another option. So anyway, I'm at the end of my diatribe. Thank you. I enjoy building this slide deck. The place you're going to want to go to get the slide deck is here, datapunk.net, uploads diadamofibrosis.pdf. And you can visit a Facebook group called Journal Club with yours truly, where I barrage people with all the feeds I follow of people smarter than me. And I write a Substack occasionally on the state of affairs in my life. But I know there might be some questions. So thank you. I apologize for the initial technological glitches. Vexing, considering my background has been my entire life in IT, but we did get it figured out eventually, which was kind of nice. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. If not, I'd be happy to drink my cup of tea here.
Fantastic. Thank you. We do have a good handful of questions. And if anyone has more questions, you can pop them in the chat. The first question is from Dr. Anne-Marie Lambert. She asks, Dr. Peter, could the fire at your home have turned on some genes to predispose you to this fibrosis?
Good question. The fire occurred after my diagnosis, which makes for a hell of a year, if you ask me. I was diagnosed at the end of November, and then my house burned down on Christmas morning. So I would say it wasn't a high point, but I don't think the two had anything to do with each other. I think working on Volkswagens maybe, but more likely, see, back in the early 80s, like I said, I bought a house from Housing and Urban Development for $29,000 and had to tear the entire house apart. And it was like lath and plaster and horsehair. You know, things you do back then. It's like, you know, nowadays everybody'd have like astronaut clothes on. But that wasn't the case back then, you know? So I suspect some of it's my own environmental mistakes that were the big cause with me, with a healthy dose of my father's excellent genetics.
And then we have a question from Val Persicaru. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, Val. He asks, does bitter orange increase fat cells, or is that a typo on one of the slides? Does bitter orange increase fat cells?
I'll have to go back and look. But fortunately, Val and I are friends. I have no idea. I don't know why it would be relevant to say that increased fat cells here. But I will look into that and get back to you on that, Val. Probably a typo. Knowing me, undoubtedly a typo.
And Val also asked, what are the effects of NAG, other sugars, et cetera, in blocking fibrosis?
As far as I can tell, not much. You know, the most significant sugars that have blocking-like functions are fucose and acetylgalactosamine, galactose. The aspects here that are being played out in fibrosis don't seem to go down that axis at all. And, you know, again, you know, my prior area of expertise was blood groups. And I would have thought, you know, that if there was some representation that had to do with glycans or sugar molecules in terms of how they plug into fibrosis, then there would be some manifestation there, but there's none. So again, I would say that the answer to that is either we don't know or there's very little to anything beyond where we are with that. There's some evidence that things like the VEGF receptor, there can be some blockade by certain oligosaccharides. I don't remember which ones they are, but the reality is that the actual fibrosis process itself is a purely protein, almost exclusively protein-driven molecular biology event.
One more question from Val. Ashwagandha is so good for this and other issues. Are there any contraindications?
In post-transplant or in life in general? Interesting, because in post-transplant, I don't know, because we'd have to go back and reverse engineer the cytochrome profile, expression profile. The things that have interactivity with cytochrome 3A4 will mess you up with TACRO. So that's why, you know, your grapefruit juice and St. John's wort and all those guys, you know, because 3A4 is a big, you know, largely interactive cytochrome. So we can find out easily enough if ashwagandha has any effect on cytochrome 3A4. Mycophenolate, which is the other drug, otherwise known as Cellcept, is goes through glucuronidation. So it's a phase 2 process and doesn't interact at the cytochrome level in terms of its detoxification. So there's very little need to worry about things that would interfere with that. So the million-dollar question would be, is ashwagandha interacting at the cytochrome 3A4 level? And I don't know.
Okay, and next we have, and I'm just going in order here, another question from Anne Marie Lambert, esophageal GERD, botanicals, blood type specificity.
Well, GERD is a condition that you will see in general across the blood groups with no great difference in distinction, because all the blood groups make a certain amount of hydrochloric acid, and a question is, where's it going? You know, is it going to be a problem when it is going through the esophagus and up through the nasopharynx area? The elements there, I think the diets specific to the blood groups would have probably the single biggest effect in modulating GERD. I had GERD for a while, but I think some of that was related to, see, one of the things you wind up with IPF is called an esophageal dysmotility. They don't know why it comes together. It's probably a situation where there's some sharing of haplotypes or genetic linkages and things. So you wind up with a dysmotility. But I think most people, if they just simply wanted to find an early, easy way to approach handling inflammation, you know, APO-specific diets are a great way of controlling the controllable elements of inflammation. Some elements of inflammation are not controllable through diet, but some of them are. And yes, we know that fatty acids can sometimes stack up either pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory. Microbiome issues can be pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory. And foods can be pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory. Well, there we can have some intelligent choices that make things a little bit better. And again, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the observation that the pulmonologist at Brigham said about that one person who was gluten-free. And I think it's probably not necessarily being gluten-free per se, but it was for them a way of controlling inflammation. And so that's probably more the ticket, is what's going to be the way that's going to be specific for this particular person to control inflammaging. Is it going to be through a complete diet change? Is it going to be through a combination of utilization of natural products plus diet? Where are we with that? You know, this is an area open to a lot of exploration, especially for us, because we deal so often with these kind of things in our practice. And again, if I had a science showing me, I had an MTHFR with a person who had obviously signs of fibrosis, who was coming in complaining of GERD, this would all be stacking up in my mind about where I need to go with my investigations. You know, what are we going to be looking at this point otherwise?
And Anne Marie also asks, with the transplant rejection drugs, do they monitor mineral losses like RBC, magnesium, CoQ10, et cetera?
They do they monitor magnesium because that's the one that is the poster child. They don't really do anything elsewise, nutrient-wise, in terms of analysis, as far as I can tell. The you know, the normal monthly visit is you go monthly for checkups for the first year, and they almost always have the same thing: phlebotomy, which could be a CBC, metabolic panel. They do a lot of allograft analysis, HLA analysis. They do a tacrolimus level, and then you go for an X-ray, then you go for pulmonary function, and then you meet with the physician. And if everything goes according to plan, they put a sticker in your windshield for another 3,000 miles, and home you go.
Okay. And then Sarah Frawley Kennedy says, thank you, Doc. I remember that one of the genotypes, I think it was teachers, age quicker. Are they prone to accelerated fibrosis?
What an interesting question. No, it wasn't a teacher. it was the warrior, G5.
That's right.
Me. I wrote the worst genotype for me. And what does it talk about there? Telomere attrition and rapid aging. And even if you look at all the biological markers, fingerprint patterns, arches, I have nothing but arches. And again, you look at that and it's like, couldn't I have given myself a better genotype than that? But it's true. Thank you for bringing that up. That it occurred to me many times that I just fulfilled my own book description.
And Val actually just made a note that
Somebody turn Val off, okay?
he's just commenting on the prior question. Ashwagandha increases CYP3A4 activity and CYP1A2. So that's good. And he gives you a link to PubMed.
Okay, great.
So yeah.
Okay, Val, we'll keep you.
And then Robin Rose asks, question about the role of epigenetic reversal, aka bioregulator peptides, to reroute the fibrosis induced by lifestyle and even the hits atop genetic defects. Would love to see that. Would love to weave that into this conversation. Thank you. This has been exceptional.
I'm not the world's greatest expert on peptides. I don't know necessarily of the role peptides play in epigenetics up until this point. I know the effects of things on methylation or on histone acetylation. There's a third part of epigenetics nobody pays attention to, which is ubiquinolation. But that's something that I have to say that I'm, like I said, my advisor in the beginning is that I will go through these organs, but I don't profess to be an organ expert in each organ. I'm an expert in the fibrosis of that organ, but not the organ itself. The reality though is peptides look real interesting unless you're Eric Topol. Then they don't look interesting at all.
Great. So we have two more questions here from Anne-Marie Lambert. Were you exposed to the Delta COVID variant of COVID-19, and could that, or being blood type A, or having gotten a COVID shot, increase fibrosis in your lungs?
I don't know if I got COVID or not. I mean, at the time, they didn't have tests. At the time they did, I think the test came out in like 2021. I mean, if I did get COVID, it wasn't, deathly COVID. As far as what was the other part of the whole thing? Oh, the COVID shot? Yeah.
The blood type A and the COVID shot.
Yeah, no, I hadn't. I mean, it's possible that, maybe that was a player, but I never got the impression that it was. As any, the thing you find that type A immune systems is they pretty much are like pin cushions. You can stick almost anything into them and get away with it. That's the problem. The interesting thing is the fact that I was mentioned this AlloSure test, that was the blood test for rejection. My numbers so far, knock on wood, have been exceedingly low. For instance, a number above 4.1 indicates a possibility of rejection. My numbers are like 0.15, 0.17. And I was talking to a pulmonologist about this, and I said, you're not going to probably buy into this, but you look down, you see most things characterized by immune tolerance. You see a lot of evidence for blood type A as being a little overrepresented. And I'm kind of counting on that, now that maybe there's a benefit in my type A, tree hugging immune system that I have, because the 1 year survival of lung cancer is about 90% in the better centers. 5 year survival is about 50%. But most of those people will go into rejection at some point, either early rejection or a late rejection. The interesting thing is once you get past 5 years, you could have a lung transplant for 25 years. There's so many people that are around with long-lasting lung transplants. And I think part of it is that your immune system sort of makes a decision about it at some point, and whether it's going to get along with it or not. And I think in the case, I have a good friend. Now get this. He's 11 years post-transplant. He's a raw dairy farmer. Okay. He breaks every rule they tell you in the post-transplant meetings. You can't have eggs over easy. You can't garden. You can only drink purified water. Right? I mean, obviously, they're thinking of listeriosis and all that other kind of stuff. Because if you get that stuff immune suppressed, it will mess you up. Okay. So, but this guy, he's grabbing cow teats and making raw milk, and he didn't give a flying you know what. And he's at 11 years. So I guess the bottom line is that you have to know what's right for yourself, and you go with that. You trust that. But I don't think, I mean, I'm sure the COVID vaccine screwed a few people up. I wouldn't doubt it. It didn't seem to screw me up that much. I tended to go for the Novavax more than the mRNAs, but I wish I, had gotten, I'm not sure there was even a Novavax at that point, but if people asked for the Novavax, we'd be a lot happier because that's just a standard vaccine. It's not an mRNA.
Okay. And last question here is from Anne Marie. Would nebulizing blood type probiotic be helpful with lung fibrosis?
That's an interesting question. I have not the slightest idea, but it opens up such a black box that I would say it's I don't know if I would say that I would go and grab the blood type A probiotic and nebulize it down my lungs. But you open the question of whether or not I would go and do some research on probiotics that are typically characteristic of healthy non-fibrotic lung tissue and see whether or not they could be isolated and put into a nebulized form. And I think we'd have to go back to that microbiome chart that I had and look under lung and see what there's not enough of, and then maybe think about making something like that. But again, you got to be real careful because you're dealing with the people that are immunosuppressed. So even, something like that could turn very bad and easily, And in a normal person, let's say we were dealing with Joe Schmo, 2 years into the diagnosis of lung fibrosis, but still working on 40% of his lungs, no immune suppressant, I'd be much more comfortable throwing things at him to see what stick.
Right. Amazing. Well, that's all the questions that have come in through the chat. We have gotten a lot of messages sending gratitude and appreciation and love to you, Dr. D'Adamo. So thank you. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us and the CNPA community. This has been amazing. And thank you everyone for being here. Dr. D, are there any last words that you want to share right now before we wrap?
I would like to thank my support team who were critical to my success and survival. Martha, my lovely wife of 40 years, and Claudia and Emily, my daughter and younger and older daughter, who were there when I most needed them. Lung transplantation is not for the soft-hearted. I mean, they literally hit you with a bus. I mean, it's amazing surgery, but you're you're really just totally knocked out, and they knock you around until, although I did manage to be the only person in the history of Brigham who ate an entire real meal in the ICU, because they told me that they don't feed you in the ICU, but they had already taken out my tubes. I was saying, I'm Italian, I got to eat. So they said, oh, you can't eat. You might aspirate. We can give you some chopped ice. I said, no, I want to eat. And they said, well, we can do a swallow test on you. And if you pass the swallow test, we'll give you some food. And so they did. And I passed the swallow test. And as far as I know, I'm the only person who ever sat down and had a regular meal in the ICU in the entire history of Brigham Women's Hospital. But again, really the thanks go to the support people and the people that get you over the goal line, because you can't do it yourself. And I'd like to thank the people that took care of me at Brigham as well. And all of you for coming and listening to this. I think, as I said before, it's not a presentation as much as it is a report of a person who had an interest in the subject, perhaps above and beyond, but also too, a feeling that if this was just, oh, my little bizarre little illness, I would have been fine. I would have not risen to the challenge. But to see the degree that this permeates everything we spend our lives dedicating ourselves towards the healing of, the amelioration of, makes me think that we've got to get a grip on this, even as just a thing, a process. It is elemental, as I said before, as treating the gut, as elemental as psychosocial importance and things. As you live, you will deal with fibrosis because you heal. Anytime you heal, you will fibrose as a consequence of that. But and so you're the accumulated, life of injury and repair. And that's going to take place in your organs. And, I mean, we've always looked at diseases and said, this is what happens. But nobody ever says, yeah, and by the way, it's like all fibrosis when you break it all down to the most basic fact. So let's start talking fibrosis as a profession. I think it'd be a helpful thing. And thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you again. And yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.